Rosenblatt. I got water down here. I am on the San Carlos School Board and also the president of the San Mateo County School Boards Association. I didn't grow up in California, so I grew up on the East Coast, moved here as an adult, didn't know much about education other than thought it had a pretty good reputation, in addition to the sunshine, what have you. So moved out here, had kids, didn't really think much, actually, about the school, but probably why I'm standing here today is probably related to a single day that I remember 7 years ago. I was driving my son, who was in kindergarten, first year in school. I was driving him to school, and the phone rang. And it was my mother calling from New York. And she goes, "So, what are you doing?" Don't worry, I actually don't do her accent. Yeah, it's fine. This is me taped. I said, "Nothing, I'm driving Benjamin to school." And she said to me, "Why are you driving him to school?" And I didn't even understand the question. So I gave a snarky sort of answer like, "Well, he doesn't have his driver's license yet." And she goes, "That's not what I mean. Why isn't he taking the bus?" And I paused, and I'm like, "Bus? Wait a second. We don't have any buses. What happened to the buses?" And I started thinking of all the things that happened. When I was a kid, I went to school. We had buses. We had teacher aides in every classroom. And I started thinking of all these things. Now, I think most people in the room know that buses aren't the worst thing we've actually lost. But for me, buses became like a symbol. Where are the buses? And I asked around, and everyone else, my neighbors, never heard of the buses. So, coincidentally, I heard from this group called the San Carlos Educational Foundation. I was looking for volunteers. So I got involved. I learned more. I went on their board for a couple of years, and then I ran for school board. I've been doing that for 4 years. And the one thing that I've learned, each year I've been more and more involved, is learning how complicated our system is, how bizarre it is, and wanting to know more how we got that way. Now, admittedly, we could spend hours and hours talking about the history. I'm going to try to do it in 10 minutes, right? And at least give a brief overview of how we got into the situation, because I think it's really important to understand that, because if you don't, it's really hard to fix it. So let's talk a little bit, let's start with the old days. So prior to 1978, local politics and representation was actually a fairly simple proposition back then. So you elected people to different local officials, school board, city council, county supervisor, hospital board, college district, whatever it happens to be. And each of those boards essentially had the power to tax you, usually in the form of a property tax. Right, so they would levy that tax, and in turn, presumably, they provide services, right, to their constituents. Now, of course, as a voter, if you didn't like the tax that you were being charged, or you didn't think the services were being provided were worth it, then of course you could vote those people out of office. But all of those decisions were made independently. The city would set its tax rate, the school district set its tax rate, what have you. As a taxpayer, you got a bill, right? You got a bill that, from your point of view, it was divided up into all of these different agencies. Right? But each of those slices of the pie were essentially determined independently. Now, there's a lot of things that worked, a lot of things that didn't work about this system, right? On the one hand, in fact, some local officials sort of called it the good old days, right? Because they had control, right? So if you were a local official, it was sort of easier to plan what you could do. And you were also held more accountable. In some ways, it's easier to hold a local official accountable. Most people in San Carlos could find me. It's kind of hard to find your state senator or your U.S. congressperson, right? So there were some benefits to that system. Now, a lot of schools and a lot of other community services were fairly well funded, but not all. It was definitely based on the wealth of that district. And by the way, this is similar to the way it happens everywhere else in the country, right? But at least for a good number of school districts, and I think they were funded fairly well. But of course, there's downsides to all this too. As California property values increased, so did the tax burden on its citizens. And keep in mind, property tax is a wealth-based tax, not an income tax. Right? It's based on how much you own, not how much you earn. So for certain members of the population, and in many cases it's seniors, but not always, who happen to have maybe an appreciated house value, but have a low income, having a wealth-based tax is actually fair to prefer. Right? So that was sort of hard in that group. And as I alluded to before, of course, there's a fair bit of inequities between sort of your rich areas and your poor areas. And again, this happens throughout the country, so this wasn't unique to California. But of course, there's a certain irony when it comes to schools, at least, right? Because when you think about education, it's probably the best ladder to climb your way out of poverty. And yet, it was the poor communities that had the worst funding for education. So, there was clearly... So, what happened in the 1970s? So, there's really two big events that happened. The first one was a lawsuit called Serrano versus Priest. It was actually a very complicated suit. We're not going to go into all the details, but the point of the suit was that that system for funding education based on the local wealth of communities was fundamentally unconstitutional, as per the California Constitution. It violated the Equal Protection Clause. The court agreed to that. The California Supreme Court actually issued 3 decisions between 1971 and 1977, basically saying you can't do it this way anymore. But it gave the legislature some time to fix the problem. So the solution that they were going to come up with was this thing that we now call the revenue limit. To say, well, let's take the poor communities and say, well, they should get as much as or close to some of those richer communities. And we'll set this limit and we'll level up those poor communities to get what the richer districts did. Okay, now this though wasn't the end of the story, because there was another big event that happened in the 1970s. You probably heard of this, Proposition 13. June 6, 1978. So Proposition 13 did a bunch of things. The first thing, of course, is it capped property taxes. Right? It also capped the amount it could grow or what have you. So on average, it cut everyone's property tax bill in half, roughly overnight. So you're a taxpayer, you have this pie, your pie just shrunk. All right, good news for you, right? One of the problems, besides the less money, of course, is where do you cut it from? Keep in mind, remember, all of those slices were set completely independently. So do you take it from the school district? Do you take it from the city? Do you take it from the county? Do you take it from the community college district? Don't know. So guess what happened? Everything got cut on a pro rata basis. And said, well, there's no other way to manage it because as a taxpayer, I'm capped at 1%. So what they effectively did was freeze those percentages in time forever. There's very limited ways in which a community can essentially reallocate, even if it's capped at 1%, to reallocate that money based on its needs. And it'd be hard to do mechanically, right, because districts overlap and what have you, right? So that was essentially the result. So certainly for our school district, there's a lot less students back then, maybe different political climate. Obviously, our percentage take of property taxes on June 5th, 1978 probably don't represent the reality today. Now, of course, Proposition 13 did a few other things, right? It required a 2/3 vote of the legislature to raise taxes. It required a 2/3 vote of the community to raise special taxes, such as partial taxes. So now, here's the rub. Combine the Serrano decision with Proposition 13. Since the total property tax bill was slashed in half, those bars go down. Now, we're going, oh my, that's a problem. How are we going to set the revenue limit up there without bankrupting the state? So what became an exercise in leveling up the poor district actually became an exercise in leveling down. And now suddenly, we actually had to lower the bar so that we can at least get some degree of equity, but we'll talk about equity in a second, right, among districts. Now, it's good to know, it's why we have the birth of something called the revenue limit. And it's good to know, and it was alluded to before, and Shelley will talk about it a bit as well, the revenue limit isn't actually a hard number. Again, we can spend a long time on that issue, but just sort of think of it as a fuzzy line. In theory, it should fall within a certain band. So now this was the birth of what we now call the revenue limit district and the base gain district. So if you're a community, let's say a school district, and you took your slice of that pie, whatever it was, of your property taxes, divided it by the number of students you had in your community, and that number was less than the revenue limit, the state said, we will backfill that amount to equal the revenue limit. If you are what they call a basic aid district, that calculation was actually more than the revenue limit. You essentially get to keep all of it. So what happened, essentially, through this combination of Serrano Priest and Prop 13 was not only only, obviously, a major reduction in local revenue, but also a dramatic shift in the burden of funding education from the locality to the state. And that plays a big part in what has happened, obviously, in the history since. Shelley's going to get up in a minute and talk a bit about another proposition called Prop 98, which was passed somewhat in response to the situation. The idea was Prop 98 was going to protect funding for schools. As you'll see as we get a little further in the story, that didn't exactly always work out the way it was intended to. So now we have these basic aid and revenue limit districts, and look at the state as a whole. A far majority of them are revenue limited. So my little bar graph didn't really do it justice because there's a lot more of the smaller bars than there are the bigger bars. Approximately 90% of 1,000 school districts in California are revenue limited. So the state has to backfill all the money for all those districts. Now it just so happens that in the Bay Area we have an unusual concentration of basic aid districts. Now, another way this affects how you run a school is, of course, how does it relate to your enrollment? A revenue limit district, as I mentioned, gets paid per student. So if your enrollment goes up, your revenue goes up. If your enrollment goes down, your revenue goes down. Basic aid districts work the opposite way. You get a fixed amount of money from that slice. You divide it over the number of students. You get more students in the district, divide it among greater students. Population goes down, right? You divide it under less students, and more money per student. Now, interestingly enough, more districts over the last 4 years have become basic aid. Not because the property tax value suddenly went up, the property tax take suddenly went up. It's because the revenue limits got reduced. So they're now above the line. So really, yeah, my son pointed out and goes, no, he's going to hit his head. What I think, and it's a really short story I'm giving you of a very long story, but I think the takeaway is that the system wasn't designed. It wasn't like there was a back room with a bunch of Democrats or a bunch of Republicans, whoever said, this is the way we're going to do it, right? Frankly, no one's happy with it. But it was sort of an accident of happenstance. Propositions, lawsuits, economic factors, a whole bunch of other things that happened that sort of created something that, frankly, no one really likes. But I think the conclusion you could draw from this is that when you have a system that essentially developed this way, the only way to fix it is through a very deliberate process. Because you can't undo this by accident, right? So that's really what today's about. So Shelley's going to come up and give you a little more of the bad news, right? And then we're going to talk a little bit about what are some of the deliberate ways that we can fix that. So, thank you for your time. I'm going to introduce Shelley Mazur, Redwood City School Board, to talk a little bit about what's happening over